Montana Highlands, November 1891. While his neighbors were stacking firewood 6 feet high and praying their stoves could burn hot enough to keep them alive through another brutal winter, 16-year-old Thomas Whitmore was digging his home into the side of a hill like some kind of human badger. The structure looked absurd from the road, a low earthen mound with a single south-facing wall of salvaged timber and glass, smoke rising from a chimney that barely cleared the ground. You could walk right over the roof without realizing a house sat beneath your feet. The exposed front measured only 12 feet wide and 7 feet tall, while the back of the dwelling disappeared entirely into the hillside, extending 24 feet into the earth. "Boy's building himself a grave," Samuel Pritchard announced at the general store, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. "Gonna suffocate in there, or collapse that dirt on his fool head. Either way, come spring we'll be digging him out with shovels." But Thomas had no intention of dying. He had spent 3 years learning from his grandfather Jacob before consumption took the old man the previous spring, and Jacob had taught him that fighting the Montana winter was a fool's errand. You didn't survive by burning more wood, building thicker walls, or stockpiling resources you couldn't possibly gather enough of. You survived by working with the earth itself, by understanding that 6 feet below the surface, the temperature stayed constant year-round, a steady 45 to 50 degrees that never froze and never scorched. Before we continue with Thomas's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of a 16-year-old orphan who built a home that stayed comfortable in temperatures that killed dozens of his neighbors, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Now, let's get back to Thomas's story. The good years felt like a different lifetime now. Thomas had grown up in a cabin 5 miles north, where his father worked a modest claim and his mother kept chickens in a garden that somehow produced vegetables even in Montana's short-growing season. Every Sunday afternoon, Grandfather Jacob would arrive on his gray mare, his weathered face breaking into a smile the moment Thomas ran out to meet him. Those afternoons were filled with walks through the hills, Jacob pointing out how animals denned, where water ran even in drought, which plants indicated good soil and which warned of clay hardpan below. "See how the badger digs," Jacob would say, crouching beside a burrow entrance. Always on a slope for drainage, always facing away from the worst wind, always deep enough that winter cannot reach. The animal knows what men forget. The earth protects what is inside it. Jacob had come from the old country, from a place where people had built partially underground for centuries, where winters were survived not by burning entire forests, but by letting the ground itself provide insulation. He would sketch designs in the dirt with a stick, showing Thomas how heat moved, how thermal mass worked, how a properly designed structure could maintain comfortable temperatures with a fraction of the fuel. Then came the winter of 1888. Influenza swept through the territory like a grass fire, and within 3 weeks both of Thomas's parents were dead. He was 13 years old. His mother's brother, Frederick Moss, took him in with all the warmth of a man accepting an unwanted debt. Frederick ran a freight operation and saw Thomas primarily as free labor, someone to load wagons, muck stables, and sleep in the unheated storage room behind the warehouse. Thomas worked from dawn until well after dark, ate whatever scraps remained after Frederick and his wife finished their meals, and spent his nights shivering under a thin blanket while ice formed on the inside of the walls. But the work gave him access to the town, and the town gave him an education in failure. He watched families burn through cords of wood trying to keep their homes warm, the stoves glowing red hot while frost still crept across the floors. He saw how the wind found every gap in the siding, how poorly chinked logs leaked heat like sieves, how people woke to frozen water buckets despite tending fires all night. The wealthy did better, thicker walls, more wood, better stoves, but even they fought a losing battle, their children huddling in blankets while precious fuel supplies dwindled. Jacob visited when he could, always bringing some small thing, a warm roll tucked in his pocket, a pair of wool socks, a book salvaged from somewhere. They would walk together during Thomas's rare free hours, and Jakob continued the lessons, his voice taking on a new urgency. "You watch what they do, Thomas," he said one bitter afternoon, gesturing toward the town spread below them. "They fight. They burn and never win. The wind takes the heat. The walls leak it. The roof bleeds it into the sky. They make boxes that cannot hold warmth, and then wonder why they freeze." "What should they do instead?" Thomas asked. "Build with the earth, not on top of it. Go down where the temperature does not change. Use the ground's warmth in winter, its coolness in summer. Let the earth do the work." Jakob's eyes were bright with fever even then, though neither of them knew it yet. "Promise me you will remember. Promise me you will not die fighting like them." Thomas promised. 3 months later, Jacob was dead, consumption taking him in his sleep. He left Thomas a small leather journal filled with sketches and notes, written in a mixture of English and German, detailing everything he knew about earth-sheltered construction. He also left him $43 in saved coins and a plot of land nobody else wanted. A rocky hillside 5 miles from town, too steep for farming, too far from water for ranching, dismissed as worthless by everyone who knew it. The final break with Frederick came 2 weeks after Jakob's funeral. Thomas had asked for a single afternoon off to visit his grandfather's grave, and Frederick had responded by dumping Thomas's few possessions in the muddy street and telling him that boys who didn't work didn't eat. Thomas was 15 years old, alone, with $43, a leather journal, his grandfather's tools, 1 change of clothes, and a hillside nobody wanted. He stood in that street for a long moment, rain soaking through his shirt, watching Frederick's door slam shut. Then he gathered his scattered belongings, loaded them into a borrowed handcart he never returned, and walked 5 miles to his worthless inheritance. The hill faced south, which meant maximum sun exposure in winter. The slope provided natural drainage, which meant no flooding or moisture accumulation. A spring, small but reliable, emerged from the rocks 100 yards upslope, which meant year-round water. The hillside itself was a mixture of clay and stone, which meant excellent structural stability and high thermal mass. A stand of lodgepole pine grew along the ridge, which meant building materials. Thomas saw what everyone else had missed. This wasn't worthless land. It was perfect. If you want to find out how Thomas's buried home stayed a comfortable 56 degrees inside, while negative 43-degree temperatures outside killed 19 people across the territory, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Thomas Whitmore built would shelter him through 5 brutal winters and change how an entire generation of homesteaders thought about survival in extreme climates. He spent 2 weeks just watching. He tracked the sun's arc across the sky, noting exactly where light fell during different hours. He observed wind patterns, seeing how the prevailing northwest winds struck the hill's opposite side while the southern face remained relatively calm. He followed the spring's flow, marking where water emerged and where it naturally drained. He studied the soil at different depths, digging test holes to understand the layering, finding clay at 18 inches and stable hardpan at 4 feet. Only then did he begin to dig. The conventional approach would have been to build a cabin on top of the hill, 4 walls, a pitched roof, a stone fireplace. Such a structure would require hundreds of logs, weeks of notching and fitting, constant chinking against the wind, and a winter's worth of firewood that a lone teenager could never possibly cut and split in time. It would leak heat through every surface, fight the wind all season, and quite possibly kill him when fuel ran low in February. Thomas did the opposite. He would go into the hill, not on top of it. He started by cutting into the south-facing slope at a spot where the hillside rose at a gentle 30-degree angle. Using Jakob's old pickaxe and a borrowed spade he'd earned doing odd jobs, he began excavating a level platform 12 feet wide. The first 2 feet were soil and roots, relatively easy to move. Below that came the clay layer, heavy, dense, back-breaking work that left his hands bleeding even through wrapped cloth. He worked from first light until dark, removing approximately 1 cubic yard of earth per day, piling the excavated material carefully to the sides. After establishing the platform, he began digging into the hillside itself, creating a rectangular chamber 24 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and 7 feet tall. This was tunnel work, methodical and precise. He would dig 4 feet deeper, then stop to install temporary timber supports, salvage posts and crossbeams that held the ceiling stable while he worked. Every 4 feet, another set of supports. He tested each section by jumping on the floor above, listening for creaks or shifts, adjusting support placement until everything felt solid. The excavated earth was not waste. Thomas sorted it carefully. The clay went into piles for later use. The rocks were stacked for wall construction. The topsoil was mounded for eventual roof covering. Nothing was discarded. 6 weeks into construction, word had spread through the territory that Frederick Moss's former charity case was digging a hole in a hill and apparently planning to live in it. Samuel Pritchard decided this foolishness needed to be addressed. He arrived on horseback with 2 of his ranch hands, reining up where Thomas was carefully shaping the chamber's back wall, ensuring it curved slightly to distribute weight evenly. "Whitmore!" Pritchard's voice echoed into the excavation. "What in hell do you think you're doing?" Thomas climbed out, blinking in the sunlight, his clothes caked with clay. "Building a house, Mr. Pritchard." "That's not a house, boy. That's a hole. You planning to hibernate like a bear?" The ranch hands laughed dutifully. Thomas waited for them to finish, then said, "Planning to stay warm without burning 3 cords of wood a month." "You'll suffocate," Pritchard said flatly. "Air's gotta move. You bury yourself in there, you'll use up all the breathable air and die in your sleep. Found a trapper once who sealed his cabin too tight, dead in his bunk, peaceful as Sunday. That'll be you by Christmas." "I've designed ventilation," Thomas replied. 2 shafts, one for intake and one for exhaust, creating natural circulation through temperature differential. "Temperature differential," Pritchard repeated mockingly. Listen to the boy, talking like an engineer. "You know what else will happen? That dirt ceiling will collapse. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually. Weight of the earth will come down and crush you flat. We'll dig out your corpse in the spring, if the coyotes leave anything to find. The ceiling is supported by a timber framework that distributes load to the walls," Thomas said. "The walls themselves are earth, which cannot collapse inward because the material is compressed, not suspended. The structure will be more stable than any log cabin in the valley." Pritchard leaned forward in his saddle. "Boy, we've been building in Montana territory for 30 years. We know what works. 4 walls, a roof, a good fireplace. You trying to reinvent the wheel, you're going to roll yourself right into a grave." "How much firewood did you burn last winter, Mr. Pritchard?" Thomas asked quietly. "What's that got to do with anything?" "How much?" Pritchard's jaw tightened. 4 cords, maybe 5. "And how warm was your house in January?" "Warm enough." "Warm enough that your children wore coats inside? Warm enough that water froze in the kitchen overnight? Warm enough that you burned through a summer's worth of cutting in 3 months and worried you might run out?" Thomas met the older man's eyes. "I watched you buy 2 emergency cords from the freight yard in February, Mr. Pritchard. I helped load them myself." The silence stretched out. One of the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "You'll be dead by Christmas," Pritchard finally said. "Mark my words, and when someone asks me why I didn't stop you, I'll tell them I tried." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, the ranch hands following. Thomas returned to his digging. By late September, the chamber was complete, a rectangular room carved into the hillside, the walls smooth clay, the ceiling held by a framework of timber posts and beams spaced every 4 feet. Now came the critical work, the thermal regulation system. Conventional houses tried to contain heat generated inside, but the materials worked against them. Wood walls were only a few inches thick and leaked warmth readily. Gaps and cracks created drafts. Roofs, being the highest point, became escape routes for all the rising hot air. People fought this by burning more fuel, creating more heat to replace what was lost. A constant battle they could never win. Thomas's system worked differently. Instead of fighting heat loss, he minimized it by surrounding the living space with thermal mass, material that absorbed heat slowly and released it just as slowly, creating stability. Earth was the ultimate thermal mass. At 6 feet below the surface, the ground maintained a constant temperature year-round, approximately 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This happened because the Earth's thermal mass was so enormous that surface temperature fluctuations, whether summer sun or winter cold, couldn't penetrate deeply enough to affect it. The ground became a giant heat battery, neither hot nor cold, but stable. Thomas's chamber sat fully embedded in this stable zone, The walls, floor, and ceiling were all earth, all maintaining that constant temperature. This meant that even with no heating at all, the space would never drop below 45 degrees. And because the space was small and would contain a human body, some minimal heating would bring the temperature up to comfortable levels, while the surrounding thermal mass prevented it from dropping rapidly again. The heating source was a small masonry stove, a design called a Russian fireplace in Jacob's journal, though the concept existed in many cold climate cultures. Unlike a conventional fireplace that sent most of its heat straight up the chimney, this design passed smoke through a series of internal chambers and channels within the masonry itself. The hot smoke heated the bricks, and the bricks radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. Thomas built his version using river stones mortared with clay, creating a structure that stood 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide. With a firebox the size of a large bread box and internal channels that made the smoke travel nearly 20 feet before exiting through the chimney, he tested it in early October with a small fire of dry pine. The smoke drew correctly, pulled through the channels by the natural draft. He let the fire burn for just 30 minutes, then extinguished it and placed his hand on the stones. They were warm, but not hot. Approximately 140 degrees on the surface nearest the firebox, cooler further away. 6 hours later, the stones were still radiating gentle heat. 12 hours later, they remained noticeably warm. The thermal mass was working exactly as Jacob's designs had promised. The ventilation system required equal precision. Thomas installed 2 vertical shafts made from stacked wooden boxes with the bottoms removed, each shaft measuring 6 inches square. The intake shaft drew from low on the south-facing wall where sun-warmed air could enter. The exhaust shaft vented through the roof mound, exiting near the stove where rising warm air created natural draft. The height difference between intake and exhaust, roughly 9 feet, was enough to maintain constant gentle circulation through the Bernoulli principle, where moving air creates low pressure that pulls more air behind it. Thomas could hold a candle near the intake and watch the flame bend inward, pulled by the draw. He calculated the air exchange rate at approximately 40 cubic feet per minute, which meant the entire chamber's air volume was replaced roughly every 15 minutes, more than sufficient to prevent carbon dioxide buildup, while slow enough to retain warmth. For the front wall, Thomas built a double-layered structure. The outer layer was timber, lodgepole pine logs he'd cut and debarked, fitted vertically and sealed with clay chinking. Behind this, separated by an 8-inch air gap, he built an inner wall of stacked sod bricks. The air gap acted as insulation, since still air transfers heat very slowly. The thick sod inner wall added more thermal mass. The result was a front wall with an effective R value of approximately 30, 3 times better than the typical log cabin. The south-facing position was deliberate. Thomas installed 4 salvage window panes, glass he'd traded 2 weeks of labor to obtain, but positioned to capture low-angle winter sun. In December and January, when the sun tracked its lowest path, light would penetrate deep into the chamber, striking the back wall and floor. Those earthen surfaces would absorb the solar heat during the day and radiate it back at night, free heating provided by the sun, captured by the thermal mass. The roof was the final critical element. Thomas laid a framework of small-diameter logs across the chamber's width, spacing them 8 inches apart. Over these he stretched a salvage canvas tarp, worn but still waterproof, weighted with rocks. On top of the canvas, he mounded earth, eventually creating a layer 3 feet thick. This earthen roof provided insulation, waterproofing, and enormous thermal mass. Rain and snowmelt would drain naturally down the hillside. The weight, several tons, was distributed across the log framework and down through the chamber walls into the stable hillside itself. For materials acquisition, Thomas worked any job available. He helped merchants unload freight wagons for 50 cents a day. He split firewood for households at 25 cents per cord. He repaired fences, dug wells, mucked barns. His reputation for quiet competence spread, and he rarely lacked work. Every penny went to nails, glass, tools. Every scrap of salvageable material, old boards, bent nails straightened, rope ends too short for others to use, was saved and incorporated. One afternoon in mid-October, crouched in the chamber applying the final clay sealing to wall joints, Thomas encountered a problem. The clay dried too quickly in some spots, cracking before it fully cured. He needed it to remain pliable longer, but adding more water made it too thin to stay in place. The memory came suddenly. Grandfather Jacob's hands mixing clay with grass, the two materials binding together. The grass holds moisture, Jacob had explained, releases it slowly. Clay stays workable longer, and when it dries, the roots make it stronger, like reinforcement. Thomas gathered dried grass, chopped it into 2-inch lengths, and mixed it thoroughly with his clay. The resulting mixture stayed pliable for nearly an hour, giving him time to apply it smoothly, and when it dried, the grass fibers prevented cracking. The joints sealed perfectly, no gaps for air infiltration. Jakob had known. The old man would never see this chamber, never run his weathered hands along these walls, never sit by the masonry stove and nod with quiet satisfaction. That grief was a weight Thomas carried every day, heavy as the earth he'd moved. In late October, a different visitor arrived. Margaret Chen ran the small cafe on Main Street, a woman who'd come west with her late husband and stayed after he died in a mining accident, supporting herself through cooking that combined Chinese techniques with Montana ingredients in ways that baffled and delighted her customers. She rode out on a borrowed mule, picking her way carefully up the hill. "Thomas Whitmore," she called. He emerged from the chamber, blinking. "Yes, ma'am." She dismounted, studying the structure with intelligent eyes. "People in town say you're building something strange." "Yes, ma'am." "Show me." He hesitated, then gestured for her to follow. Inside, the chamber was dim but not dark, light filtering through the windows and the open door. The walls curved gently, the timber framework visible overhead, the small masonry stove squatting in the corner like a patient animal. Margaret walked slowly around the space, her fingertips brushing the walls. She stopped at the stove, examining the construction, then crouched to peer into the firebox and up into the channels. Finally, she stood, dusting her hands. "How much wood will you burn in a day?" she asked. "In deep winter, maybe 15 pounds, less if the sun shines." "How much do conventional cabins burn?" 60 to 80 pounds on cold days, more in storms." She nodded slowly. "My husband's family built something like this in California, dug into a hillside near Sacramento. I only saw it once, but I remember it was cool in summer and warm in winter. His grandmother said people had built that way for centuries before the Americans came with their frame houses." She met his eyes. "This is actually quite clever." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, not pride exactly, but relief. Someone understood. "Will it work?" Margaret asked. "I believe so." "Good. The world needs more people willing to try things differently." She pressed $2 into his hand, despite his protests. "Payment for letting me see something interesting. You ever need a meal, you come find me." She rode off, leaving Thomas standing in the entrance, the coins warm in his palm, and something like hope flickering in his chest. By mid-November, the structure was complete. Thomas moved his few possessions inside: a straw-filled mattress, 2 wool blankets, 1 change of clothes, Jacob's journal, a cooking pot, a tin plate and cup, a knife, an axe, and his grandfather's Bible. The chamber that had taken 3 months to build now became home. The first night, he lit a small fire in the masonry stove, just enough to test the system fully loaded. The temperature outside was 18 degrees, cold but not yet brutal. He let the fire burn for an hour, feeding it small pieces of pine, then banked it and let it die. He placed his father's old thermometer on a wall peg and watched. At 8 o'clock, when he extinguished the fire, the interior temperature read 54 degrees. By 10 o'clock, it had risen to 58 degrees as the stove radiated its absorbed heat. At midnight, it was 57 degrees. When he woke at dawn, the thermometer showed 54 degrees, exactly where it had started, despite no fire burning for 8 hours and the outside temperature dropping to 12 degrees. Thomas lay in his bunk, warm under a single blanket, and felt tears slide down his temples into his hair. It worked. Jakob had been right. The earth was protecting what was inside it. He began keeping records, meticulous notes of outside temperature, inside temperature, fuel consumption, fire duration, numbers that would silence the doubters if he survived long enough to show them. December arrived with snow and dropping temperatures. The first serious cold snap hit on December 18th, -8 degrees outside, sustained for 3 days. Thomas burned one small fire, morning and evening, each lasting perhaps 40 minutes. Inside temperature, 56 degrees, fluctuating only 2 degrees over 24 hours. Comfortable enough to work, sleep, eat without shivering. He used 11 pounds of wood per day. In town, people burned through their wood piles at terrifying rates. Families huddled close to roaring stoves. Children slept 3 to a bed for warmth. Frostbite cases appeared at the doctor's office. Christmas passed quietly. Thomas spent it alone, reading Jakob's journal by candlelight, tracing the familiar handwriting. On December 28th, the cold deepened. -15 degrees, then -20. January brought no relief. The cold locked in, day after day of temperatures that made exposed skin freeze in minutes and turn breath into clouds of ice crystals. On January 22nd, the coldest morning yet arrived. Thomas woke to an eerie stillness, the quality of silence that comes when air itself seems frozen solid. He dressed and climbed out through the entrance tunnel. He'd learned to keep clear of drifting snow. The world was white and still, and so cold it hurt to breathe. His thermometer, hung on the exterior south wall, read -38 degrees. The sun rose into a sky so blue it looked brittle. No wind, just pure, killing cold. Thomas retreated inside, lit his morning fire, and ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush. The chamber remained 56 degrees. He burned his usual 15 pounds of wood across 2 small fires. By evening, as he prepared for bed, his exterior thermometer read -43 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, by the light of a single candle, Thomas recorded the numbers in Jakob's journal. Exterior, 43 degrees. Interior, 56 degrees. Fuel consumption, 15 lbs. Status, comfortable. In town, 5 miles away, people were dying. Samuel Pritchard's youngest daughter developed pneumonia in a house that couldn't stay warm, despite a fire that burned around the clock. The Hendersons' cabin caught fire when a desperate attempt to increase heat caused a chimney crack they hadn't noticed in the dark. Old Mr. Jameson froze to death in his sleep when his fire went out, and he was too weak to restart it. Families crowded into the hotel, the general store, anywhere with a large central stove, burning furniture when firewood ran out. 19 deaths across the territory were attributed to that cold snap, with dozens more suffering frostbite, illness, and hardship. Margaret Chen thought about the quiet boy and his buried house and felt a growing dread. Nobody could survive -43 degrees in a hole in the ground. She'd seen the structure, admired it even, but this was beyond any reasonable expectation. She lay in her room above the cafe, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and made a decision. When the temperature rose enough to travel safely, she would go check. She would probably find him frozen, but at least she could bring his body back for proper burial. The cold broke on January 26th. The temperature climbed to a balmy -5 degrees, and Margaret set out on her mule, bundled in so many layers she could barely move. The journey that took an hour in good weather took 3, the mule picking carefully through snow that in places had drifted 4 feet deep. Margaret's face ached despite her scarf. Her fingers went numb inside their gloves. Twice she nearly turned back, but the image of Thomas's body lying frozen and alone kept her moving forward. She crested the final rise and stopped. The hillside looked like a white blank, the buried structure invisible under snow, except for the single south-facing wall and the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney. Smoke. Active smoke. Margaret urged the mule forward, her heart suddenly pounding. She reached the entrance, a small tunnel through the snow berm that had been deliberately cut, snow walls smooth and vertical. Before she could call out, the door opened. Thomas stood there in shirt sleeves, no coat, no hat, his face peaceful and well-rested. "Mrs. Chen," he said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" Margaret stared at him. Then she stumbled forward into the entrance tunnel, and Thomas quickly stepped aside to let her pass into the chamber itself. The warmth hit her like a physical thing, not the fierce blast of a roaring fire, but a gentle, pervasive comfort that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. She stood there gasping, her frozen face beginning to ache as circulation returned, her body shaking with something between relief and disbelief. "What temperature is it in here?" she managed. Thomas checked his wall-mounted thermometer. 56 degrees. "What was it outside this morning?" -12 when I checked at dawn. And during the worst cold, when it hit -43, 56 degrees. Margaret reached out and touched the wall. It was slightly warm, as if alive. The floor beneath her boots felt solid and stable, not cold like cabin floors always were. The air smelled clean, a trace of wood smoke, but fresh, not stale. Light from the south-facing windows illuminated the space with a soft glow. "How much wood are you burning?" "About 15 pounds a day. 2 small fires, morning and evening. The stove heats the bricks heat the space, the earth holds the temperature steady." "I burned 30 pounds yesterday alone," Margaret said softly, "and my room was still cold enough to see my breath." Thomas said nothing. Margaret stood there, feeling the warmth soak into her bones, watching this teenage boy who'd built what everyone said was impossible. On a wooden shelf, she saw a leather journal, its pages covered in careful handwriting and sketches. "Your grandfather's?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Everything I know came from him." "He would be proud." Something flickered across Thomas's face, grief and gratitude tangled together. "I hope so." Margaret stayed for an hour, asking questions Thomas answered patiently, explaining principles of thermal mass and insulation and ventilation in clear, simple language. He showed her his records, pages of temperature comparisons, fuel calculations, observations about sun angle and heat retention. The numbers told an irrefutable story. This structure worked better than anything in the valley, built by an orphan teenager with no money and no support, using principles dismissed as primitive by everyone who called themselves modern. "People need to know about this," Margaret finally said. "Yes, ma'am." "They won't want to believe it." "No, ma'am, but the numbers don't lie." "No, ma'am." Margaret rode back to town, her mind churning. By evening, half the town had heard her story. By the next day, the other half had heard it and decided she was either mistaken or lying. By the third day, Samuel Pritchard announced he was riding out to see for himself. He arrived alone, his face haggard from a winter that had nearly killed his daughter and cost him 8 cords of emergency firewood purchased at crisis prices. He didn't knock, just pushed open the door and stepped inside. Thomas, who'd been reading, stood up from his chair. Pritchard looked around slowly. His eyes took in the comfortable temperature, the minimal fire in the stove, the carefully maintained living space. He walked to the thermometer and studied it. He placed his hand flat against the earthen wall and held it there for a long moment. Finally, he turned to Thomas. "What's the temperature?" 58 degrees, Mr. Pritchard. "Outside?" 4 degrees when I checked an hour ago. Pritchard nodded slowly. He didn't apologize. Men like him rarely did. But his voice when he spoke held something new, something that might have been respect. "Show me how it works." Thomas spent 2 hours explaining the system. Pritchard asked intelligent questions about load-bearing capacity, ventilation rates, thermal mass calculations. He examined the masonry stove, the insulated front wall, the roof structure. He studied Jacob's journal, running his finger down pages of sketches and notes. "My daughter nearly died," Pritchard said finally. "We burned every piece of wood I had, and the house still wouldn't stay warm enough. Doctor says she'll recover, but it was close." He met Thomas's eyes. "I need to learn this. My family needs this. Will you teach me?" "Yes, sir." The knowledge spread slowly at first, then faster. Pritchard built an earth-sheltered addition to his ranch house, using Thomas as a consultant, paying him consultant rates. Other families followed. Some built partial structures, 1 or 2 walls earth-bermed. Others went full underground like Thomas's original. The techniques adapted to different situations, but the core principles remained. Thermal mass, insulation, passive solar, minimal heating. By 1895, 43 earth-sheltered structures existed in the territory, ranging from small root cellars to full family homes. The Montana Agricultural College sent a professor to study Thomas's original structure and document the temperature data. The resulting paper, published in an engineering journal, brought attention from as far east as Chicago. Thomas never sought profit. He taught freely, helped with difficult construction problems, shared Jacob's journal with anyone interested. He built 7 more structures over the years for families who couldn't afford conventional housing, charging nothing, asking only that they maintain temperature records to add to his growing data collection. In 1897, he met Sarah Mackenzie, a school teacher from Helena who'd read about his work and traveled to see the structures for herself. They married in 1898, and she moved into the hillside home that had now become a minor landmark. Together, they raised 3 children in that buried house, and those children never knew what it meant to shiver through a Montana winter. A gray cat named Smoke lived with them for 14 years, a mouser Thomas had found half frozen as a kitten during that first terrible winter. Smoke died peacefully in 1906, and they buried her on the hillside above the house, marking the spot with a river stone. The original structure stood for 63 years. Thomas lived there until his death in 1954 at age 79, Sarah beside him until her own death in 1951. By then, the principles he had demonstrated had influenced thousands of structures across the Northern Territories and Plains states, saving incalculable amounts of fuel and uncountable lives. His funeral drew more than 200 people. They came from across Montana and into Wyoming and the Dakotas. Families living in earth-sheltered homes, engineers who'd studied his techniques, grandchildren of people whose lives had been saved by structures built using Jacob's wisdom and Thomas's patient implementation. His grandson Daniel gave the eulogy, standing in the small cemetery where Thomas would be buried beside Sarah and not far from Jacob's grave. "My grandfather was called crazy," Daniel said, his voice carrying over the assembled crowd. "He was mocked for building a house in a hill. People predicted he would suffocate, freeze, or be crushed. He ignored them all. He built what he knew would work, based on wisdom passed down from a grandfather who learned it from old country traditions that went back centuries. He tested it, proved it, and then spent the rest of his life teaching anyone who wanted to learn. He never became wealthy. He never sought fame. He simply lived, raised a family, and helped his neighbors survive. Rest now, grandfather. Jacob is waiting for you, and the houses you built still hold their warmth." The structure itself was eventually modernized. Electricity added in 1947, plumbing in 1949, a propane heater installed, though rarely needed. The family maintained it until 1991, when it was donated to the Montana Historical Society. It stands today as a preserved historical site, the original earthen walls still intact, the masonry stove still functional. Visitors can walk through and see the thermometers Thomas installed, read excerpts from Jacob's journal, understand how a 16-year-old orphan with no resources survived and thrived in conditions that killed his neighbors. 3 grave markers stand on the hillside above the structure. One reads, Jacob Whitmore, 1821-1891. He taught what the earth already knew. Another, Thomas Whitmore, 1875-1954. He built what others said was impossible. The third, smaller marker, Smoke, 1892-1906. Good cat. Warm friend. The cold snap of January 1892 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged. That surviving Montana winters required fighting the cold with massive amounts of fuel, accepting waste and hardship as inevitable costs of living in a harsh climate. Thomas Whitmore proved that wrong, not with theory, but with thermometers and careful records and the simple fact of his survival. And the simple fact that he was comfortable while others froze. The principles he used were ancient, developed by earth-sheltered cultures around the world over thousands of years. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest built partially underground structures that stayed cool in 100-degree summers and warm in freezing winters. The Icelandic turf houses used earth insulation to survive subarctic conditions with minimal heating. The Chinese Yaodong cave dwellings maintained stable temperatures year-round. The Iranian Yakhchal stored ice through blazing summers using thermal mass principles. Modern science has confirmed what Jacob knew intuitively. The Earth's thermal mass at 6 feet depth maintains a temperature roughly equal to the annual average air temperature of the location, warm enough to prevent freezing, cool enough to prevent overheating, stable enough to eliminate the wild fluctuations that conventional structures experience. A properly designed Earth-sheltered structure can reduce heating and cooling costs by 70 to 90%, compared to conventional construction. Thomas Whitmore succeeded because he was willing to question assumptions everyone else accepted as truth. He had nothing, no money, no family support, no social standing, but he had observation skills, patience, and willingness to learn from wisdom older than the modern world's confident dismissals. What Samuel Pritchard built quickly with purchased materials and hired labor has long since rotted and been replaced. What a 16-year-old orphan built slowly and carefully with his own hands, and his grandfather's knowledge still stands after more than a century. There's a metaphor about quick solutions versus lasting ones, about working with nature instead of fighting it, about knowledge shared freely versus hoarded for profit. Thomas Whitmore never became famous, never wrote books about his techniques, never sought recognition. He simply lived, raised his family in comfort, and taught anyone who asked. The 43 structures he built or consulted on sheltered hundreds through the brutal winters of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, providing warmth and safety when official systems and conventional wisdom offered only hardship and risk. Most of those original structures are gone now, but the knowledge survives in engineering manuals, historical records, and a growing modern movement toward earth-sheltered and passive solar construction that rediscovers what traditional cultures never forgot. So here's the question for you. What abandoned wisdom exists in your own life? What knowledge has been dismissed as primitive or outdated simply because it's old? What might happen if you looked at your challenges the way Thomas looked at that worthless hillside? Not as a problem to fight, but as a resource to understand and work with. If this story resonated, if it made you think differently about survival, innovation, and the value of questioning assumptions, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message about building solutions instead of fighting losing battles. Leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through patience, observation, and the courage to try what everyone said was impossible. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't given to you by conventional wisdom or modern convenience. Sometimes it's the one you build with your own two hands, guided by the wisdom of those who came before and proved by the numbers that don't lie.